You've heard the phrase comparison is the thief of joy. What if comparison is also the thief of something much more tangible than joy is? Stick around and this episode of StewardShift will explain.
1, 2, 3, 4.
This is StewardShift, a show that gives you the tools you need to get the most of your best resources. Your money, your mind, your body, your time.
I used to get made fun of in middle school for not having all of the clothes and sneakers that the other cool kids used to have. My parents had this stupid rule that they wouldn't pay more than $50 for a pair of sneakers for me. And as I think back on it, it really wasn't stupid at all. I'm grateful that they instilled that kind of thinking in my mind. But that really limited my options if I wanted to be like the cool kids. Because I compared myself to others who had more than me, or at least they had more sneakers and more clothing than I did, I used to do almost anything to be considered one of the cool kids. So today, I actually like to dress up and to look good, and I actually don't mind spending a little bit more than average in order to do that, but it no longer comes from a place of comparison. So for the first thing that comparison robs you of, let me just share with you an experience that I used to go through. I live right outside of DC. I don't live far from DC at all. And I do a lot of business in DC. I go and run errands and whatnot. And I noticed something about myself that when I used to drive through the city, I would start getting this kind of dark and moody kind of feeling, almost depressed. And one day I just kind of looked up and I put my finger on it. Like I said, okay, I've got to name this. I can't keep being dark and whatnot as I drive through the city. And I noticed that as I was driving through DC, that I would see a lot of homes that were being bought and renovated and sold or rented out by landlords. And of course, you know that DC is just one of those really, really hot real estate areas where it's just being gentrified very, very quickly. And a lot of people who have money are buying things up and moving there and are renting these places out. And as I would drive through, I noticed myself just kind of reflecting on what these people had in terms of rental properties. And then I would begin to reflect on what some of my friends have in terms of rental income properties. And then I would think about what I don't have in terms of rental income properties. Now, this is a goal for myself and for Rochelle, my wife, but we're not quite there yet. And I just noticed that I would compare what I don't have with something that people did have. And I would just get dark and kind of moody and darn near depressed. So this is the first thing that comparison robs you of. Comparison robs you of your mental wellness. When people compare themselves to others, there are two possible ways that they can compare themselves to them. They can either, number one, have a downward comparison, or they can have an upward comparison. A downward comparison is where you're kind of up here, kind of feeling high and mighty, and you see someone who doesn't have what you have or doesn't have as much or don't look as good as you might look, and you look down on them as you compare yourself with them. And that kind of comparison, it may seem like you're elevating yourself somehow, but it actually gives you a fragile base for your self-worth, because at some point in time, someone else who you're not going to be able to look down on is going to come along, and maybe they'll look down on you, or at worst, you'll compare yourself to them. And because you've spent so much time looking down on somebody else who isn't as great as you are, now kind of derived your self-worth from comparison. And when you find someone who you're not as good in whatever capacity, your self-worth now will suffer because you've been playing this comparison game with people for so long. Then you have what are called upward comparisons, where you're kind of down here, so to speak, and you're comparing yourself to someone who's up here. And you'll find that this will ruin your self-worth quicker than anything, because just like the people who have downward comparisons, you're finding your self-worth in comparison with somebody else. And the reality is, if everyone can just be completely honest, the people that you are comparing yourself to are also comparing themselves to somebody else. And so we get depressed and we have this low self-worth because someone has something better than what we have. And the reality is that we'll find ourselves depressed because we're not as great as them when they're probably depressed as well, because most people do compare themselves in ways to people that are just unhealthy. And by the way, all forms of comparison are not negative. Someone once said that you are the average of the 5 people that you spend the most time with. You become like them because you spent a whole lot of time observing them. Observation can actually be a positive form of comparison because it doesn't have the motive of self-judgment. When you judge yourself and make negative conclusions about yourself because of someone else's appearance or someone else's income or someone else's weight or someone else's skin color, you get robbed of your joy. So comparison, first and foremost, is the thief of your mental wellness. Now, for the second thing that comparison robs you of, I got to go to the wise man. His name is Solomon, one of the wisest people to ever walk this earth. He says in Proverbs 14, verse 30, a heart of peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones. The second thing that comparison robs from you is your physical wellness. Now, you may not believe me, but comparison does cause your health to decline. Now, what happens when you compare yourself to others is that your body gets flooded with stress hormones. And when you have those stress hormones in your body for an extended period of time, you start getting an increased risk of heart disease and an increased risk of some cancers. That is something that has been studied and proven by research. So that's the second reason that we should not compare ourselves to others. If you want to take care of your physical health, make sure you don't play the comparison game. The third reason why you should not play the comparison game, well, let me say it like this. A wise man once said that you should never look into your neighbor's bowl unless you're making sure that they have enough. Comparison robs you of your financial wellness also. When you compare yourself to others, you tend to take your eyes off of your own goals and you begin to make short-sighted money decisions. For instance, if you see that someone posts on social media that they took this beautiful luxury vacation in this remote part of the world and you start comparing it to the staycation that you were about to take, your own financial plan will be at risk if you let that comparison boil down in your spirit. I had to realize that I just wasn't in the same place financially that someone else might have been in, and that my financial plan is based on the values that my wife and I, Rochelle, that we've set out for us and our family. Everyone else doesn't have the values that we might have. So I explained to you earlier in this episode that I was just having these dark, kind of moody feelings driving through DC. But I had to realize that, look, most of the people out here probably don't have the exact same values that we have. For instance, we have a value in our family that we give away 20% of our income. Now, I don't know what people's giving habits are, and I don't want to judge or say that someone else isn't doing this. I really don't care. But if I were a betting man, I would probably bet that the vast majority of people aren't giving away 20% of their income. That's something that we do, and that's based on our values. And I can't judge where we are financially or what we're able to do financially versus what someone else is able to do financially because we just may not have the exact same values. Another core value that Rochelle and I have is that we put our kids in private school. And I know that private school obviously isn't the cheapest educational option, but it's something that we decided long ago that we always wanted for our children. That's one of our core values. And because that's a core value, yes, it is a bit more expensive, significantly more expensive than putting our kids in public school. But look, those are our values, and we're going to continue to decide what we want to do financially based on the values that we already set out, instead of comparing ourselves to someone else who may not have the exact values that we have for us. And here's the last thing. I want to warn you about 2 words that will throw off any financial plan and will lead you to bad money decisions guaranteed. Here are the 2 words. I deserve. Now, I know that most of us say this probably pretty frequently. I deserve a new car. I deserve better clothing. I deserve that dream vacation. And you very well may be right. I'm not here to dispute your rightness or wrongness about what you deserve or don't deserve. But I want you to be cautious about those two words, because oftentimes those two words are based on our comparison to somebody else and what they might have instead of what we really want and what our financial plan and our values dictate. All right, so here's the scripture, and I'm going back to the wise man. If you couldn't tell, man, Solomon is probably my favorite author in the Bible. But he says in Ecclesiastes 4, verse 4, then I observe that most people are motivated to success because they envy their neighbors. But this too is meaningless, like chasing the wind. Solomon in his observation, and Ecclesiastes is just one huge observation about life. And he observed the motivation behind people's yearning for success. And he said that people are motivated usually, if they're not careful, because of envy, because of jealousy. Yes, because they're comparing themselves to their neighbors. But he says that this is meaningless, that this means nothing. This is like chasing the wind. It doesn't make sense. You're not able to make the financial progress that you really want to make. You're not able to have true success in life if you're basing your vision of success on comparing yourself to somebody else. All right, so here's the bottom line. A survey says that 48% of millennials, half of millennials, have gone into debt with the motivation of keeping up with their friends. That's a lot of millennials, half of millennials, and that's a lot of money to go into debt with just to keep up with someone else. Look, we got to check our motivations. We got to check this comparison game, because if we're going into debt, not because of so-called necessity, not to go to school, not to do something like really, really important, but just to keep up with other people, just because we're comparing ourselves with somebody else, there's a huge, huge problem. And we really got to check not just our motives, but we got to check our values to make sure that what we're doing financially is in line with what our vision is for our lives. So here's a shift that you can make in your own life. This is how you can stop comparing yourself to other people. And there are actually 4 ways you can do this. So the first one is, don't be fooled by what you see. Here's the thing. What people post on social media and otherwise is their absolute best self. But everyone's best self isn't constantly on at all. Like, people do have bad days. People do experience bad weather. People do eat bad meals. But when they post continually the best of themselves, the best meal or the best vacation or the sunniest day or the best outfit, we think that this is who they are 100% of the time. And that isn't anyone who lives on the face of the earth. And the second thing, and is very much related to the first one, reduce your time on social media. The more time we spend on social media, the more exposure we get to everyone else's life, and the more we're tempted to compare ourselves to everybody else. Just kind of get off of that. Stop the scrolling. Maybe limit your time every day, or limit the days that you get on social media so that you can limit your comparison. Thirdly, turn your comparison into a positive. I mentioned earlier in this episode that instead of just comparing, well, just make an observation. There's nothing wrong with observing. Comparison can get you in trouble, but observation is okay. And when you observe, turn it into motivation. If you're tempted to be jealous or envious of what someone else has, well, don't allow it to be self-judgmental. Turn it into a positive thing by being motivated. Well, if someone else has that vacation, okay, well, let's not be jealous of it, but let's be motivated to get something that's similar. Or let's be motivated to say, okay, well, they're spending money on that. Well, I'm not going to spend money on that because I'd much rather fully fund my retirement or invest into a Roth 401k or Roth IRA, or I'd much rather buy a home with my money. Well, turn it into motivation and say, okay, well, that may not necessarily be my goal, but I'm going to fuel my passion and my motivation by what my goal is and not what theirs is. And that leads us to the fourth and final way you can stop comparing yourself to others, and it's to keep your eyes on your own goals. Their goals may not be your goals, and your goals may not be their goals, but you can handle your money in a way that makes sense to you. For more information about how to save for your own goals, check out this video on how these 3 ways of saving will prepare you for 99% of your life. Check it out.